So, I stand before you as someone who used to be chairman of a network of finance ministers under the HIPIC initiative. So I know very much the pain we went through to be able to deal with the debt issues. But then I also went on to become a lender at the African Development Bank. So I know that it is possible to get it right. And that is the first thing I want to leave you a thought today. Africa can get it right. There's nothing new we have not dealt with before, and we can resolve. Because this matter is not about debt, it's about fiscal discipline. A number of countries have been cited here because they get their fiscus right, they make an effort at raising revenues, they've got well-planned public investments, and in spite of the attractive lenders, because that's what the problem is. The lenders are knocking on the doors of finance ministers. Can we lend you money? So it is possible to get it right. And I'll give you an idea how. In spite of a few accidents, which have been described here. But I want to begin by thanking you, ODI, for doing this. Because what you have done is something I've been struggling with over the last few months. Reading the Western press, you'd think there is a crisis right now in Africa. It was almost like here we are again. And I want to tell you that in spite of the few difficult cases you have had, the majority of the African countries are getting it right. As they did, by the way, in 2008, during the global financial crisis. There was this view that Africa was the continent most likely to suffer. It actually turned out that Africa was the continent best prepared to withstand the shock because of fiscal discipline over the previous few years and the shock absorbers which had been built. So I want to thank you for organizing this debate because you are bringing some kind of a sensible conversation in a polarized debate. So it's polarized how? You open up a newspaper, oh, China is about to go to colonize Africa again. But where is evidence? I've looked at a number of countries to see actually China's contribution to their debt. Often it is actually the lowest part of the ladder. The second thing, African countries are going to build new white elephants, all right? But I've looked around to look for these white elephants. I can't find them. What I find are railways, are dams, are highways being built because of the second problem I want to tell you. This conference says avoiding a new crisis, a new problem. But what was the old problem? The debt crisis in Africa in the 1990s, in the 1980s, was not caused by the Eurobonds, was not caused by China. Most of the debt was from international financial institutions. And most of the debt was concessional lending, by the way, by the World Bank, regional banks, and bilaterals. It was not commercial lending. So why were African countries unable to pay at the time? They were unable to pay because of the social, political, economic crisis which the continent was going through. Economies were contracting everywhere. Civil wars in almost 12 countries. And so many of these countries were experiencing negative growth at a time of increased population. That was the debt crisis, as it is described. I prefer to call it the growth crisis, the dark days, the years called of Afro-pessimism. It was not caused by debt. It was caused by poor growth prospects arising out of a social political crisis. So if we're to address a new problem, it is extremely important we distinguish it from the old problem. The new problem, I would like to describe the following way. What Antoinette's successor, the IMF, has called a trilemma. So how do you describe it? In the next 20 years, Africa is going to face the biggest challenge humankind has ever faced. With these population dynamics, which are very familiar, the continent will have to make huge amounts of investments in human development, in infrastructure development, to be able to reap the so-called demographic dividend. That is well understood. It's a challenge we face. Now, I've heard also, without a strong case there, that we need to make a big effort to raise domestic revenues. I totally agree. I think the IMF feels that all our countries can make an effort around 2-3% of GDP extra, not immediately, but over maybe 5 years. Yes, I do agree. We need to improve public financial management. Yes, of course, and the quality of investments. But believe me, at least now Antoinette is here, she can correct me. I've looked at the numbers for many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and I think one of these papers makes the point. It is extremely difficult at this stage for many of these countries to go above 18% of GDP in revenue. Kenya, long time ago, used to have around 21%. It was the star performer. Of course, if you exclude Seychelles, Seychelles are 32%. I don't know how they do it. But many other countries are struggling between 14%, 17, 18%. There's work to be done, but it takes time until the economies are transformed. So the domestic base is what it is, 18% of GDP. Then we have got these population dynamics in the next 20 years. We've got this infrastructure gap. So what you call the trilemma was, A, the domestic base of revenue is very narrow. The requirements to invest in the future are very high, and you want to contain debt. So how do you close this? And I want to suggest to you that it can be done, but it cannot be done in a polarized debate of I told you so. It cannot even be done, in my view, by bringing back what I call external agents of restraint. I've heard this morning say, well, get the IMF to do this, get the World Bank to do the other, get the donors to come back. It won't happen. It won't happen. It will have to be an internally generated effort at anchoring fiscal discipline. It can't be external parties telling African governments, don't do this, don't do that. Those days are over, they are gone. It is about national institutions, it's about national governments, it's about national parliaments, making sure that the fiscal discipline, which we built over many years, is consolidated. But I think to go back to those days whereby, I won't call it conditional lending, but to those days of here's the money, here are the policies, that will not do. But what can do is to have a conversation we're having now. So what are the instruments we have to ensure that countries do the right things? Do you know one of the things which have gone wrong? I've observed about 4 countries who have borrowed money, and I've tried to see what the problem was. Forget about easy money, of course. Bankers wanting to lend at any price. It is what I call the asymmetry of negotiating power. Many of these countries going to negotiate in the Eurobond market or elsewhere, they've got extremely bad deals. At least 2 of them which I've seen. I called up one of the advisors. I said, this was a bad deal for the country. But the countries don't have negotiating abilities. So they sign on to some of those bad deals. So I think one thing you could do, ODI, for example. I know in the past there have been issues of you build debt capacity, but there's no political will to see it through. But it's important we rebuild the capacity of the countries to manage their debts and negotiate good deals. You can hire expensive lawyers from London or expensive investment bankers, but they often end up negotiating for the lenders, not for the borrowers. I think if we can find a way to rebuild the capacity of the countries to plan their issuance, to manage the debt, to plan the investment, I think we'll come to a sweet spot. And I'm hoping you could develop some research along these lines. We get out of this polarized conversation to actually a constructive conversation. What can be done? Now, we'll have a few of our Greases, of course. There will be always the bad examples point to which have done terrible things, that's for sure. But that is true for Ukraine, it is true for Zambia. There's nothing African about it. So those kind of outliers, we have to treat them as outliers. I'm talking about the steady state case, wanted to close this trilemma of investing in their people in a narrow domestic base, but wanting also to manage debt as I've learned to do over the past years. That for me would be the kind of work ODI is well equipped to do, because you have no, how do I call it? You're not speaking for this or that government. You're not speaking for this or that lender. You are taking an objective, scientific view of the problem. My second point, and I'm not sure how to frame this for you. In the 1980s, many African countries went through crunching structural adjustment program. Forget what Greece went through. This was nothing. Many of our countries went through tough times. And those tough times are the ones which had prepared us during the global financial crisis. The balances, both external and internal, were reasonably okay. Level of reserves were reasonably okay. We no longer had the overvalued currencies, maybe except one, I don't know. Things had worked very well. And that had built a momentum for growth, which you can see now in Africa. Because again, looking at newspapers about the impending crisis in Africa makes me look, wait a minute. But if you exclude the top three engines of our continent, South Africa, Nigeria, and Angola, which have been going through particular challenges, the rest of the continent is doing quite well. Many of the other countries are growing at above 6%. But because South Africa, Nigeria, and Angola account for about 52% of the region GDP, you often see numbers which look quite bad. But the rest of the continent is moving on. And I'm not persuaded for a moment that we're about to throw all that away, because even the people will not accept. So I want to say here that a combination of good research without polarized views, a combination of good research on how you manage the new type of problem, which is different from the old type of problem, would be extremely helpful. I've heard people say there'll be no other HIPIC. But HIPIC was meant to resolve a multilateral debt problem, mainly. HIPIC was meant to deal with a multilateral debt problem, which in the past could not be forgiven. So it was a breakthrough to forgive multilateral debt. But there are countries, a few, who had been borrowing money on the London Club or some other expensive loans from bilaterals, and that had to be restructured often in the Paris Club. And in the last few years, I've not heard many countries do that. So I think that if you focus on those issues, you'll find many clients on the African continent. Now, I'm sure yesterday you discussed the China in detail. I will not do so. I simply want to say here, from where I stand, that I think that one thing which Africa's cooperation with China has enabled us to do is to close the infrastructure gap in a significant way. From the Lunatic Express, do you know it was built? Mombasa to Nairobi, all the way to Uganda, do you know it was built? Does anybody know?
By the British.
By the British? Does anybody know? I think it was 1906. Can you imagine East Africa's largest economy still running on a rail built in 1906? And so they went forward. They borrowed money to do this railway. Now, there could be issues about, so was this investment done right? The phasing, the sequencing, the timing? My view is yes. Same for Ethiopia and Djibouti. Same for many other power stations. Now, could we do it better? Yes. This is, of course, something which we, African governments, and the Chinese colleagues have to discuss, how to improve on the lending programs, on the choice of investments, on ensuring that there is good performance so that investments return are realized. But the idea that somehow African countries are walking into this trap, eyes closed, is okay for the headline, but it is not the reality on the ground. Now, when it comes to investments badly selected, this applies actually to all the lenders, including some badly done projects, incidentally, from institutions including the one I was leading. That's a totally different problem. How do you make sure that in your PFM, the choice of investment is done in a way which will bring you the returns? So I think working out of this kind of, I hesitate to use the word caricatures, and focusing on the real problem would be extremely helpful. And I want to commend you for that. Now, so G20. So shall we go to the G20, have a new charter on debt? I am discussing that with my friend Jamie. Because the G20 was born out of a crisis. You know, since about when? Maybe the last century. Each time I've got a crisis, a new organization is set up. So, World War I, you had the League of Nations. World War II, you have United Nations. By 1973, it had shown its limitations during the global energy crisis. So the G7 was set up, an informal arrangement. I think it became later G7 plus 1, then plus 2, I think.
And -1.
Oh, yeah. So you had a new club of the rich to try and deal with the energy issue. But come fast forward to the global financial crisis. Of course, even the G8 was no longer fit for purpose. So the G20 was set up to deal with the near-death experience which we are all facing. In my judgment, the first meeting in London here was excellent. It achieved results. It stabilized the global economy. It put out the fires under Gordon Brown. But since then, it is my own assessment that probably the G20 is not as effective as it was at the beginning. And therefore, we'll have to be sure that this group, where the majority of Africans are locked out, yes, they are locked out. Because it's a club, to use the word, it's a club of the rich and the super rich. So those of us who are said to be systemically unimportant are out of the room. So if we do that, we have to make sure there's a degree of ownership, so that it is not, again, people speaking to Africans from the high hills. It will have to be something which can be owned so that the fiscal discipline is anchored from internal processes. So I would hope, Jamie, that as we discussed it, the role of the G20 would be a supportive one, because it will be talking to people who are not in the room. It will be talking to people out of the room. It is true South Africa is there because of its size, and the African Union has a representation with two seats as invited guests. As invited guests, not as participants. So what is the, in my view, the best way forward? I go back to the issue of it happens, it will happen in the countries. My country has been started several times. We're still a very poor country. But we manage our debt quite okay. Investments are planned reasonably. We know how much to borrow, both internally and externally, because there's that internal self-discipline. You can balance the needs and the available resources. I am satisfied that every single African country can actually get to that point of managing their finances sensibly. I'll end with an example, Botswana, which again Antoinette knows very well this story. In 2008, during the global financial crisis, diamond prices fell below the floor. You know, diamond prices are usually first to go during a crisis like that. Now, the government of Botswana approached us, African Development Bank, I mean, I still think I'm there. And they said, look, A, we have this problem in our budget. I think they were running about 12% deficit or thereabout. We don't want to raid our sovereign wealth fund. That was the level of discipline. We don't want to raid our sovereign wealth funds. But we don't want to increase our dependence on outside debt either. So what they did, they crafted their own internal program, adjustment program. They cut expenditures. They increased domestic revenues. But they still had a small gap in the budget. And they came to us. And we gave them the biggest budget support loan the bank ever gave, which was $1.6 billion. Now, that is some money. But you know what? Within a year, Botswana was negotiating with us to prepay the loan because they have been able to stabilize their economy. Of course, bankers don't like clients who prepay the loans because. But I took the view that, wait a minute, these guys deserve support. The other country was Mauritius, who did exactly the same. So I think, if I recall, I went to the board and accepted that they prepaid the loan because they had stabilized their finances. So it is possible, it is doable. Some will lack the capacity, we should help them to get the capacity. A few will lack the political will, so is Ukraine and Greece. But I want to thank you for what you have done, because you are taking the word an impending doom and crisis in Africa at a time when actually, in my view, with the exception of those 3 countries who are struggling, and a few countries who have done things wrongly, that the majority of countries are getting things right, and we can get there. So I want to thank you and wish you well for your future work. Thank you.